The king in the north!
Dracarys.
I will hurt you for this.
I am the sword in the darkness.
Lion doesn't concern himself with the opinions of the sheep.
Let me give you some advice, bastard.
Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.
400 years ago, the Doom fell on Valyria. Mountains cracked open like eggs, lakes and rivers boiled, fountains of fire, ash and smoke spewed from the ground, so high and so hot that even dragons burned in flight. The land splintered, and the angry sea rushed in. In hours, the greatest city in history became history.
When the Doom claimed Valyria, the great Freehold fractured into warring cities and upstart nations, ripe for the taking. Out of these swarmed the Dothraki, the horse lords of the plains who feared only defeat and dragons. And now the dragons were all gone. They sacked and burnt every town and city in their path.
What is up, everybody? Jeremy Eisenfire here, and welcome to the channel. And today, we'll be diving into Part 3 in our The Birth and Fall of Old Valyria series. In Part 1, we took a look at exactly how the Valyrian Freehold rose to power in the first place, going from reportedly simple shepherd folk to the dominant nation in the known world, and the center of knowledge and the very pinnacle of innovation. And in Part 2, we take a look at the Doom of Valyria and what potentially could have caused this mighty empire to fall, and the coming of the Targaryens to the island of Dragonstone. And now, in Part 3, we will be concluding the series with the Century of Blood, a period of time in Essos in which the destruction of Old Valyria created a massive power vacuum on the continent, causing war and strife that lasted nearly 100 years. The Valyrian Freehold was once the mightiest empire in the known world. After the defeat of the Giscari at the hands of the Valyrians, they went on to create a vast empire stretching all the way from the Narrow Sea to Slaver's Bay, and were known for being the most advanced civilization in the known world. That was, of course, until in 102 BC when the Doom of Valyria fell on the continent. After the 14 Flames, a chain of active volcanoes that lie along the Valyrian peninsula, erupted all at once, splitting the once giant landmass into a ton of tiny different islands as the sea rushed within, destroying the Valyrian Freehold forever, with fires that burned so hot and rose so high that even dragons were consumed. The destruction of Valyria greatly reduced the number of dragon lords that were left in the known world. House Targaryen, of course, had relocated to the island of Dragonstone some years before the Doom fell, yet they were not the only dragon lords that were lucky enough to escape the Doom. A few other dragon lords who were said to not have been in Valyria during the time of the Doom survived as well, in Tyrosh, Lys, and Qohor reportedly, but it is also stated that these dragon lords did not live very long past the Doom, and while we don't know the fate of all of these dragon lords, the fate of one of them has been recorded in the annals of history. According to the legend, Urion, a dragon lord that had been visiting Qohor at the time of the Doom, proclaimed himself the very first emperor of Valyria, and raised a force of well over 30,000 men along with his dragon, and attempted to reclaim what was left of Valyria. But unfortunately, things did not go as planned for Urion, his dragon, and his 30,000 men, who reportedly marched on the remains of Old Valyria and were never heard or seen from again. Not long after Urion's attempt, Volantis, which was now the mightiest of the 9 free cities after the Doom, tried to lay claim to Valyria's empire as well. But one thing that none of the 9 free cities were counting on was the coming of the Dothraki. After the Doom of Valyria, with no more dragons to keep the Dothraki at bay, they came swirling out of the east, sacking and burning towns and cities along the way, leading to the destruction of several different realms. The Dothraki drove small folk from their hovels and nobles from their estates, until only grass and ruins remained from the forests of Qohor to the headwaters of Selharu. Yet the city of Volantis was determined to claim what was left of Old Valyria. As Volantis considered themselves the first daughter of Old Valyria, they thought themselves the most rightful successors to the Freehold. At which point, a political party from Volantis known as the Tigers, who had descended from Valyrian blood, called for war upon the other free cities, taking control of Lys and Myr, and commanded the southern reaches of the Rhoyne, and continued to rule their two sister cities for 2 generations. Volantis, however, would soon discover that they were up against their own resistance, beginning when the Volantene attempted to take control of Tyrosh. Yet, in the end, all of the free cities, with the exception of Lorath, would end up rebelling against Volantis. Pentos openly gave Tyrosh their aid, while the cities of Myr and Lys both rebelled as well, while Cahor and Norvos also made their own alliance against Volantis, destroying a sizable portion of the Volantene fleet that was controlling the Rhoyne at Dagger Lake. And even the Sea Lord of Braavos would go on to send 100 ships to Lys to further aid them. And even the lands of Westeros would go on to be affected by the Century of Blood after the fall of Valyria. Argilac Durandon, the last of the Storm Kings in Westeros, led a host into the disputed lands, where he defeated an army of Volantene attempting to retake the city of Myr. And even House Targaryen was not exempt from the Century of Blood as well, as even Aegon himself, who would later go on to become Aegon the Conqueror, was also drawn into the conflict. The cities of Pentos and Tyrosh approached House Targaryen and Aegon at Dragonstone, where young Aegon agreed to join the alliance against Volantis. Mounted on the back of his dragon, Balerion the Black Dread, Aegon flew to Lys, where the Volantene were preparing an invasion, at which point he set the entire fleet ablaze. Volantis would also go on to try their hand at claiming the very remains of Old Valyria itself. But unfortunately, much like Euron and his 30,000 men and his dragon, the Volantene fleet that they sent to reclaim Old Valyria disappeared in the Smoking Sea and was never seen again. And with Volantis so preoccupied in fighting the rest of the free cities, it left their entire eastern side very vulnerable to attack from the Dothraki, of which they took heavy advantage. In the end, a second political party would rise to prominence, known as the Elephants, who would go on to seize control of Volantis. After having power for almost a century following Valyria's doom, the Tigers were displaced by rising Elephants, and ever since, at least 2 of the 3 triarchs of Volantis have been Elephants each year. While Volantis had once been the most powerful of the free cities after the Doom of Valyria, the Century of Blood and the power vacuum therein would go on to leave the city broken, bankrupt, and depopulated. And the once very fertile disputed lands were now devastated by war. And even to this day, the cities of Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys often go to war over their borders. The Dothraki, however, would continue to go on to rise in power. After emerging from the eastern grasslands of central Essos, they exploded into war. Khal Mango would go on to unite 60 different Khalasars and focused on the west. The tall men of the Kingdom of Sarnor ignored the threat the Dothraki posed, instead attempting to use them in their own wars, which in the end would prove to be the ultimate undoing for the Sonori, as hostilities between the Kingdom of Sarnor and Dothraki would culminate in the biggest battle to take place during the Century of Blood, the battle that has forever become known as the Field of Crows. With the Dothraki burning and sacking many cities within the Sonoran Kingdom, the Sonori would eventually unite under King Mazor Alexi. After gathering the bulk of their forces, which consisted of 6,000 scythed chariots, 10,000 armored riders, 10,000 light horsemen, and over 100,000 spearmen and foot soldiers, the Kingdom of Sarnor was eventually ready to go to war with the Dothraki. Together they would be facing the might of over 4 different Khalasars and 4 different Khal's armies, which consisted of around 80,000 Dothraki riders. When the battle commenced, the Sonori chariots began to cut through the Dothraki, causing them to retreat. But little did the Sonori know, they were about to run head first into a massive trap laid by the Dothraki. When the Sonori gave chase, they eventually fell right into the hands of Khal Horo's survivors, who fired wave upon wave of arrows into the Sonori, while the other 3 Khals began to move in with their armies. Khal Kono attacked from the north, Khal Zako attacked from the south, while Khal Lasso attacked from the rear, preventing the Sonori from retreating on any side. And the Dothraki easily went on to decimate the forces of Mazor Alexi and the Sonori, culminating in the bloodiest battle to take place during the Century of Blood, which claimed the lives of well over 100,000 men. The Dothraki would go on to become so feared throughout the continent that men would kill their wives and children to keep them from falling into the hands of the Dothraki. By the time the Century of Blood had come to a close, the Dothraki had gone on to claim many different cities, including the Sonori and the old city of Giscar. Although the events of the Century of Blood take part mostly in Essos, they did stretch far beyond that as well, not only getting parts of Westeros involved, but also stretching as far south as the continent of Sithorios. After the Doom fell, raids would reportedly take place as far south as the island of Nath, raids that would become so frequent, in fact, it would force the natives to move further inland. It is said that the city of Golgassos prospered during these years, growing rich and powerful. However, in 37 BC, the city was hit by a terrible, mysterious plague called the Red Death, which left the city shunned for a century thereafter. Overall, the period of time known as the Century of Blood brought countless waves of death and destruction to the continent of Essos and beyond, creating a massive power vacuum that consumed many cities and realms. And the ruins of Old Valyria would go on to become one of the most haunted places in the known world. And the collapse of the continent itself gave birth to the smoking sea that rose therein, a haunted body of water where the sea fluttered into the shattered remnants of the Valyrian Peninsula after the Doom. The sea is said to be filled with volcanoes and smoking stacks of rock, and is said to boil and be haunted by demons. A once mighty empire that was the very height of civilization in the known world, now reduced to a haunted ruin that no man dare enter. But that is going to do it for us today on Part 3 of the Rise and Fall of Old Valyria and the Century of Blood that followed. And if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave a like on your way out, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications as well to stay up to date on all of our upcoming content. And if you missed Part 1 and Part 2 in our Rise and Fall of Old Valyria series, you can catch both of these videos in the description below. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to everybody out there for watching, and a huge thank you for all of the channel members, and we will see you on the next one.
Dracarys.
I will hurt you for this.
I am the sword in the darkness.
Lion doesn't concern himself with the opinions of the sheep.
Let me give you some advice, bastard.
Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.